Great. Well, welcome everybody. We're really excited to have you all here. We've really assembled an all-star panel. Three or four of the folks that when I want to learn more about the Gulf, I read, and I think you will all immensely benefit from their contributions. We're at a very unique moment in this regional war, and I think more generally in the state of relations between the United States and the Gulf. Really a core tenet of that bilateral or multilateral relationship has been the security relationship between the two countries. The idea that the U.S. Provides a security blanket for states in the Gulf in exchange for advanced American positioning in the countries, and really in many cases a blind eye to the repression that we've seen in the Gulf for many decades. However, this decision to go to war, and in some cases, and we'll learn more from our panel, over the objections or concerns of some countries in the Gulf has made Gulf countries a target. So instead of a shield, the U.S. presence has made them, in many cases, a target. We're at a moment now, of course, where there is a very tentative ceasefire, but even as we're speaking today, there are developments happening on the ground that raise the risk of further escalation. And regardless of how that ceasefire agreement unfolds, there are really serious questions about the nature of dynamics in the Gulf, from the Strait of Hormuz to the U.S. relationship to the Iran nuclear program, that will affect the state of U.S. GCC relations for a long time to come. So you're here to hear from our panel and not from me. So let me just say a word about the format of the event. We're going to do this in the format of some moderated rounds of questions. We'll do probably two or so of those, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. You can pose questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom application. My colleague Alex will be monitoring that closely and feeding questions to me. Of course, I have so many of my own questions, so I will try to limit those, though, and give you all space to ask your questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the speakers as I put my first question to them, and that way we can just jump right into the substance. So I'm actually going to start with Hamidreza Azizi. Hamidreza is a scholar of Iran and Middle East geopolitics. He is a visiting fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, really a well-regarded institute for thinking through some of these issues, and an associated researcher at the Klingendale Institute. His research focuses on Iran's foreign and security policy, Iran-Russia relations, and the regional order in the Middle East. Obviously, all very relevant to the moment we're in. He's also the co-editor of the Klingendale blog series, Iran in Transition, and the author of the forthcoming book, The Axis of Resistance, Iran, Israel, and the Struggle for the Middle East. I think maybe he did know, but little did we all know how relevant that title would be in 2026. So Hamidreza, why don't I kick off with a question, to you, which is really, we saw some sort of warming, in relations in recent years, especially Iran and Saudi Arabia, but there were others. Of course, there's a spectrum of relations in the Gulf. But let me just ask you the general question: how has this war impacted the state of Iran-Gulf relations?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join you and also other colleagues on this panel. So on the book, of course, it was quite a challenge, actually. And as I was writing it, developments were unfolding. I was finishing the chapter on Lebanon and the war with Hezbollah basically happened. So it was quite a challenge. Anyway. Speaking of the current moment and the GCC, so we need to look back a little bit, and especially I think kind of a comparative perspective, comparing the current war or recent war, hopefully, with the 12-day war of June 2025, may be a little bit helpful. So the things that did not happen back then, but did happen this time, and one of them being, of course, Iranian attacks on its neighbors around the Persian Gulf. Back then, I was arguing this not only on the matter of Iran's relations with neighbors, but also on the activation, or better to say lack thereof, of the Iranian partners of proxies within the axis of resistance. That the main reason for that, the main reason that Iran didn't go for the extreme, the main reason why the so-called regional war that everybody was warning about did not happen back then was that Iran did not see itself on the threshold of an existential danger. So the Islamic Republic did not feel an existential threat, and as a result did not act in the sense that would kind of double down on, or better to say, it would increase the challenges. So the aim back then was to sort of it was sort of a damage control with the minimal cost possible, and to somehow contain the conflict, especially in the sense that, as we all remember, the United States was not involved from the beginning, and it wasn't involved to the end. It was just one-off operation against the Iranian nuclear program, however significant it was, but it didn't amount to kind of active and comprehensive participation in the war, and that mattered a lot. Iran didn't want to expand the conflict in a way that would, lead to further American involvement. But that was, I mean, this time it was quite different for a variety of reasons. One was that the trajectory that Iran was in already after, I mean, in the period between the end of the 12-day war until the start of this one, was one of kind of attrition in all different aspects, in its economy, in its even, the way that environmental challenges became kind of security threats for not only the regime but also for the states, broadly speaking. And eventually, we had the protests as a result of all this, and kind of as a culmination point of all these factors, the protests in January this year, that kind of, it was the most significant and in terms of the participants, the biggest ones since at least the Green Movement of 2009. And then the brutal repression, the massacre of thousands of protesters. So all these together had already, raised the threat perception on the Iranian side. And here comes a very important factor, which is again very important in understanding why Iran reacted in the way that it did against its neighbors and overall in this war. And that was the fear of what I call it, the fear of convergence, the convergence of an internal and an external security threat at the same time, something that the Islamic Republic experienced during its 8 years of war with Iraq. So, especially in the earlier years of the war, where when there was the threat of armed movements in different parts of the country, separatist movements, everything. So the whole security doctrine of the Islamic Republic was based on preventing this convergence, for the recurrence of this convergence. And that was why they went to the extreme in suppressing the protesters. In their view, they resorted to the kind of maximalist tools in order to empty the streets in the expectation of an attack, of a foreign attack that was coming. So that was the context. So they entered into the war while this sense of vulnerability and fragility was kind of all over. And the mention by Ali Khamenei before his death that any war, if it happens, would be a regional war, that means that they had already planned for all this. They had planned for the killing of the protesters inside of the country as a message to the domestic audience, not to even think about taking the opportunity of a foreign attack to take to the streets, bring down the regime, and to the external audience that, if we did that to our own people, just imagine what we are going to do to you. And that's exactly what they did. So this sense of existential threat means that all other considerations, like, for example, the rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, other things went away. So when you feel existential, there's no long term. That's what I always say. So you need to secure that in order to be able to think longer term. So that's sort of a scene setting. I don't want to take much time. Then we can get into the details of future trajectory. So the reason that Iran, as I said, went to the extreme in dealing with these and started targeting indiscriminately all the countries around the region was that they wanted to show maximum force in order to end this war on more favorable terms to them and also to deter future attacks in their view.
Thank you, Hamidreza. And that's fascinating to think about the ways in which the rhetoric around regime change made, in some ways, as you said, this existential threat and the convergence and also the extent of planning. There's a lot of seeds there to explore further. I want to move next to Mira Al Hussein. Mira is a non-resident fellow with Dawn and an Emirati socialist specializing in the Arabian Peninsula. Her interdisciplinary research explores contemporary Gulf histories, state society dynamics in the region, and women's agency. Currently, her work explores the migration of Gulf citizens in their diasporic activism. I will say she's written a couple of really brilliant recent articles for Democracy in Exile that I highly recommend folks read. Mira, maybe a couple of questions I want to ask you, but I'll start by saying, we talk about, even this panel talks about the GCC countries and, as if they're a bloc. But we know that there is a spectrum, right, of views within the Gulf. So maybe I can ask you to say more about that spectrum, the ways in which that spectrum, if you think, has, narrowed or grown in the course of this 6 weeks, almost 2 months, I guess now, and how has the Gulf strategic thinking evolved, maybe within that spectrum, especially as it relates to the question of its relationship with the United States. A lot there, but hopefully you can unpack that in 5 minutes.
Thanks, Omar. First of all, we know that the Gulf is not really united. The GCC is just an umbrella that brings together people with, countries with competing interests and competing geopolitical pursuits and even threat perceptions. And we've seen this most starkly in this war. I'm going to go to your last question. And I think it's important to kind of note that Gulf states have had ample time to prepare for this moment, which explains, I think, the collective dismay and disappointment in the security offerings of the U.S. when it was finally put to test and did not deliver. I think they had an inkling of how things would turn out in 2019 in Khays and Bqiq in Saudi Arabia, and then 2022 in the UAE, and then more recently in Qatar when it was subject to first Iranian and then Israeli attacks. And I think that the hands-off approach of the U.S. should have really provided early warnings to these countries, but also to the entire region. And I think Saudi Arabia registered that early when it pursued rapprochement with Iran, realizing that, okay, maybe there's just not enough kind of umbrella there in terms of security. And I think Oman is a very exceptional case. It registered this discrepancy from the start, and I think it really pursued a very different trajectory from the get-go. And it learned by watching, not by experiencing, that it needs to not really take sides. It needs to hedge and kind of keep everybody happy. I know for outside spectators, Oman appears to, even for its Gulf neighbors, Oman appears to be leaning towards Iran against its neighbors and their obvious choices. But I want to caution against too much reading into this. Oman is being very pragmatic here. It understands in the way that Saudi Arabia and Qatar are beginning to understand that Iran is not just a forever neighbor. It may actually emerge out of this as a regional hegemon, and they need to kind of prepare for that sort of scenario. And I want to consider two plausible endpoints here in this current U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. If it succeeds in toppling the ruling system and installing a friendly government, whether drawn from the war-cheering exiles or Western-inclined figures from within the country, the outcome is not really favorable for the Gulf. Now, if the war falls short, leaving behind a hardened remnant of this current system that consolidates into a military dictatorship, which is really an outcome. If you look at other states like Egypt, Gulf states would cheer on this, they would accommodate this, if not prop it. But in the context of Iran, this is also not a very favorable outcome. The common assumption, of course, is that a Western-friendly Iranian government or a state would overshadow the Gulf economically, diplomatically, et cetera, et cetera. But that is only part of the story, especially after this war. I think we should not discount the internal messaging of Iran to its populations of over 90 million people that Gulf states are co-belligerents in this war. They've opened up their territories for the U.S. to strike Iran. And we remember the first casualties of this war were the school children of Minab. With this kind of emotional residue, I think moving forward with any type of Iranian government that will emerge would not be very easy for Gulf states. I think many Gulf states understand that both outcomes present really distinct challenges, and they're not, both outcomes would concede some form of regional primacy to Iran, either through alignment with the US or coercion by a new military junta that formalizes control over Hormuz, which then becomes another casualty of a receding international order. I think importantly, this war has exposed the depth of fragmentation within the GCC. The UAE, Bahrain, and I think to a lesser extent Kuwait are the camp that is reluctant to assume a wait and see approach as Saudi Arabia and Oman and Qatar. They favor a more confrontational one they're willing to join a coalition, but only if the other Gulf states would relent. The idea of a unified Gulf front joining at this critical moment where the U.S. is nominally present is seen as opportune. I think the UAE feels that the window is narrowing for decisive action, and it's necessary to act now in order to reset the status quo, especially pertaining to Hormuz. They're very concerned about that. So for the UAE, it is important to distribute the political risks and the military costs, which the UAE understands is going to be immense, but they feel that it is worth it to push back against Iran emerging as a dominant actor in the region. And they feel, the Gulf states, all of them feel, at least this is where they agree, that the US is all too willing to allow that to happen. I hope I answered your question.
No, you did. You didn't get on a lot of food for thought, both in terms of the fragmentation, but also in terms of like this question of like, are there any good outcomes out of this for the Gulf states? So I want to move to Annelle Sheline, a PhD. She's a research fellow in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. She previously served as a foreign affairs officer at the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor's Office on Near East Affairs before resigning in March 2024 in protest over the Biden administration's illegal support for Israeli military operations in Gaza. And listening to Mira talk about, the Gulf being prepared, I remember that I think 2 days, or just couple days before this war broke out, you published a long piece that talked about Qatar, Saudi Arabia exploring alternatives to the U.S. And at the time, I think you mentioned what Mira mentioned, that the September 2025 Israeli attack on Doha. But I want to sort of feel free to comment, I know, on what Mira mentioned, but I sort of want to maybe flip a little bit to the United States approach to the Gulf. Obviously, a lot can be said about why the United States decided to, wage this war. But can you say a little bit about how the relationships with the Gulf factored into that decision making, and how it's approaching this war with Gulf states, and how it's impacting those relationships?
Certainly. First, it's so great to be here with you all. Thanks for reading that report, which we did try to get out right as it seemed like the U.S. was about to attack Iran, and then unfortunately it did happen. But yeah, as you said, there was already this sense among the Gulf states, and in particular, I looked at Saudi and Qatar because they're the two most significant customers, purchasers of American weapons. And as Mira had mentioned, already there was this sense that, to what extent are Israel and the United States instigators of conflict and insecurity, whereas the understanding of the U.S. Gulf relationship had long been that the U.S. was the guarantor of security and of the entire economic model for this part of the world. So that dynamic was already present, and then we got the war. But in terms of, the question of the U.S. Gulf relationship, I mean, you think back to almost a year ago when Trump made his first international trip of his second term to the Gulf states, to Qatar, Saudi, the UAE, and made all these great statements about how the US wasn't going to do nation building, no more stupid regime change wars. And I think the Gulf leaders really felt reassured by that. They felt that Trump was their guy. To really ensure that, they bribed him out the wazoo, the $400 million plane that the Qataris apparently are still on track to send to Washington at some point this summer. We'll see if that ends up happening. The massive investments, back and forth also in terms of thinking about the US committing to send chips, the fact that AI and supercomputing are part of the effort by these Gulf countries to ostensibly transition off of oil. They've been talking about that for decades, but there have been renewed efforts to really rethink these countries' dependence on oil. So all that to say, you had Gulf countries that really felt reassured that, Trump was their guy. The Saudis were glad that Biden was out, given that relationship had started off quite frosty, when Biden refused to even meet with Mohammed bin Salman, although he quickly shifted on that stance. And just acknowledging the reason for that was the murder of Khashoggi, the founder of Dawn. So I think that the Gulf countries were truly flabbergasted by the fact that they thought they had Trump in the bag. They thought they had really bought their way into his ear, and then they were not consulted. They did everything they could to try to prevent this war, knowing that they would be in this position where they didn't want this to happen, and yet now they are the targets of Iran. And throughout, we saw Gulf countries maintaining publicly that they were not allowing the U.S. to use their territory, to use these U.S. bases to launch attacks. However, there are some questions around that. The reports, I mean, certainly the Iranians think that the Saudis allowed, for example, the U.S. to use King Fahd Air Base. The Iranians think that the U.S. also used Emirati territory to attack Iran. Riyadh and Abu Dhabi deny that, but there's at least this perception. So the big question now, I think, is, are these Gulf states rethinking their reliance on the United States as a security guarantor? I mean, given that I should lay my cards on the table working at the Quincy Institute, which advocates for a less militaristic U.S. foreign policy. And the Quincy Institute's position has long been that it doesn't make sense strategically for the United States to maintain this sort of forward-basing position of 50,000 U.S. troops just permanently stationed in the Middle East. The Middle East is really no longer as strategically as important as it used to be. And Trump himself campaigned on this. I mean, this is something that really a lot of Americans recognize. Americans oppose these stupid endless wars. And yet here we are. And I should point out that the Gulf states had felt really alarmed by that because they see this sort of the notion of a U.S. pivot to Asia and the possibility of the U.S. removing U.S. troops, no longer maintaining such a robust basing presence in the Gulf. They had historically seen that as their security guarantee, that this is what's going to protect them. And so this war ostensibly has undermined the logic of that paradigm. And yet at the same time, I don't anticipate that we're going to see the Gulf countries fundamentally rethink their reliance on the United States. I think they have invested so much in this relationship. I think that in particular under Trump, they know that he would really take that very personally. At the same time, we had already seen a lot of these countries diversifying their security relationships. You think about Qatar having experienced the shock of the U.S. greenlighting the blockade that Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other states launched on Qatar in 2017. So during that time, Qatar had to rely heavily on Iran, on Kuwait, on Turkey. Qatar had previously signed a security arrangement with Turkey. So Qatar has, for the most part, stayed within kind of the NATO umbrella as far as expanding their security relationship, whereas the Saudis, famously 8 days after the Israeli attack on Qatar, they signed a defense agreement with Pakistan. This was actually just sort of a beefing up of an existing agreement, but it did get a lot of attention. And the big question was, to what extent then does the Pakistani nuclear umbrella extend to Saudi Arabia? The Pakistanis apparently were sort of like, no, that wasn't what we were signing up for. And so this, and in particular in the context of the war, there has been this question of, well, so what does this Pakistani-Saudi arrangement actually mean? We have seen obviously the Pakistanis stepping in to act as mediators, which is kind of a new role for them. But they themselves see it as in their interest to try to de-escalate and prevent this conflict from expanding even beyond it's already it's already sort of engulfed the region, but it could get bigger. So I think, and the fact that the Saudis and the Turks have certainly, I mean, there's a long period of tension there, but they have moved past that and there's a possibility of a Saudi, Pakistani, Egyptian, Turkish sort of four-way security arrangement that has been discussed. But again, it's this question of while the Qataris and the Saudis are expanding their security relationships, to what extent, like, how does that operationalize? And I think although it's not what I want to see, not what my preference would be, I think there has been some fairly convincing scholarship from military experts arguing that the extent of sort of the existing infrastructure, to the extent of the U.S. military relationships with these countries, and in particular the personal relationships. This was something I certainly observed at the State Department, where you saw the extent to which you had these high-level personal interactions. And obviously, I think that dynamic is only deepened under the sort of highly personalistic approach of the Trump administration to international relations and diplomatic relations. But where you have those kind of close personal relationships, you do tend to see a status quo, like these relationships maintain. And I do think that is a key part of also what explains kind of the ongoing U.S.-Israel relationship, is this sense of kind of we're on the same team, even if increasingly Israel's actions demonstrate that they are not operating in a way that supports the interests of the United States or the world or really anyone or even their own interests. But we'll get into that a little later. Just one more point to make here. I think, one of the big questions is, are the U.S. bases going to be rebuilt? Although it's been frustrating that things like this, the satellites these companies have not been providing updated information. We don't have much transparency into the extent of the damage, in particular at U.S. military installations, but also just across the Gulf. And so to what extent are these U.S. bases still even operable, and who would pay for rebuilding them? I don't think that the Gulf states, they are certainly feeling the pinch economically. And so to what extent are these bases, who just made them a target, really worthwhile for them to rebuild? So even if they wouldn't officially declare we're not going to rebuild the U.S. bases, they may be sort of slow, and it may over time become clear that that's not really going to happen. I think one final thing to say there is to acknowledge the 6-week detention of Ahmed Shihab-al-Din, a U.S. citizen, by the Kuwaiti government, in addition to many other people who have been unjustly detained for simply posting on social media. Ahmed posted a publicly available video to his social media, and he's an American citizen. So he's sort of the most prominent example of the fact that these Gulf states have been locking up their own citizens, foreign citizens, merely for sort of publicizing the extent of the damage that the Gulf states have suffered. And I know Don has also done a lot to try to draw attention to his unjust detention.
Thank you. I think you've raised some of the very key questions that I think we're unpacking in this setting, and I think this question of the alternatives versus the how much has been invested in the rigidity of the relationships is a really fascinating one. Abdullah Alaoudh, I want to turn to you now. Abdullah is a senior policy advisor for the Gulf issues at the American Committee for Middle East Rights. He previously served as the Countering Authoritarianism Senior Director at the Middle East Democracy Center and was the Saudi Director at the Freedom Initiative. He was a visiting adjunct professor at the Elliott School at George Washington University and served for 2 years as a senior fellow at the Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. He was also a postdoctoral fellow at Yale's Center for Islamic Law and Civilization. And before joining the Freedom Initiative, he also served for 3 years as the director for the Gulf here at Dawn. And he's the Secretary General and co-founder of the National Assembly, NAS, Saudi's first openly declared political party, which calls for an elected parliament and constitutional safeguards in Saudi Arabia. Abdullah, I had intended to go to you on the last point that Annelle raised around, repression in the Gulf around the war. And I'm going to get that question to you. But I actually want to maybe take a step back and ask you a question that's been on my mind and the minds of many others, which is there's been so much reporting about what the position of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince, was before the war, right? Did he support? Was he pushing for a war? Were there concerns raised? And then there's also been reporting about the positioning of Gulf states now. And again, you've heard from Mira and many others about the spectrum of views, and there have been visits back and forth. What are Gulf states currently now calling for behind the scenes? What are they telling the U.S.? How are the fragmentation that Mira mentioned? How is that playing out in this moment? What are the tensions there? So maybe I can just kind of ask this off the fly in terms of just the reporting about what people were saying before February 28th, and then where you think Gulf states are at this moment in terms of what they're pushing for, given what we've heard about the lack of really good outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's an excellent point that Mira made about the fragmentation, and we have been following this, observing this for now at least 2.5 years, especially the rift that was growing from inside the Gulf between what used to be the two most solid allies, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and very powerful forces that have been engaged in Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Yemen was basically the straw that broke the alliance back, perhaps. So this impacted their also reaction to the war, given that UAE was part of this normalization, one of the earliest champions of Abraham Accords, signed early on. Also, Saudi Arabia, in the early stages, in the first term, was on board with this Abraham Accords, but they were not. They did not think that the value that they didn't think that they were given the enough perhaps compensation for their reputation, for the things that they're going to pay as the big Saudi Arabia, the guardian of the two holy mosques, whatever they call it. So the thing is that this rift and other rifts between other Gulf countries impacted the reaction to the war. That made UAE closer to the position of Israel, that they're more, I would say, behind the scene, I would say more enthusiastic toward pushing for finishing the job and all that. On the other hand, I think all the reports that you see about leaks of the Saudi Crown Prince pushing for more like war and all that. I think it's just the wishful thinking of the more Israeli American camp that they want to involve Saudi Arabia, and they think by doing all these leaks, they make 2 points. One, provoke the Iranians into thinking that Saudi Arabia was really, involved and therefore attack Saudi Arabia more, and then put Saudi Arabia in the position to really be to move from more reactionary to more, I would say, more not from the defensive camp to more like offensive, like kind of UAE is starting to make now. So I think most of the reports that I've seen, they only cite U.S. officials, foreign officials, Western officials. You may notice that, and it's clear. It's like, where all the royal court officials that you used to speak to? Where are all the Saudi officials? Where are the Gulf officials that you can really report on and talk to? When we speak, I remember when we used to try to push for a human rights story, they would most definitely cite a Gulf official and a royal court, and they will always push back against all human rights narrative. But suddenly, for this specific narrative about like Saudi Arabia wanting and behind the scene to push for this war and more war and finishing the job and all that, is just like suddenly no officials cited. So again, so this is, I think, so what I think Saudi Arabia wants to see in this war is, yes, a weakened Iran, but not a regime change, because regime change means so many different things that Saudi Arabia does not want. It wants, yes, a weakened Iran that does not threaten Saudi Arabia, but not weak enough to be a threat of chaos to the region and Saudi Arabia and the minorities of the Gulf. So I think that's, and also to be kind of counterbalancing Israel, because Saudi Arabia, as you guys and all my colleagues here said, started from what I can call the Doha moment, when the Americans not just green lighted an Israeli operation in Doha against Hamas leaders, but also used a U.S. base for that. So the U.S. base that was supposed to be a protection for the Gulf became more of a threat. This scenario now is becoming bigger and bigger with this war on Iran. All these bases that theoretically were there to be protection for the Gulf. Some of the Gulf leaders, and I'm saying some because I know there is a big now discussion among the Gulf leaders themselves and big divergence on how they think about things and react to things. But at least from like Saudi side and Qatar side to some extent, and Kuwait and Bahrain. Bahrain is leaning more toward UAE, but not there yet. But Qatar and Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman is really like a different, animal, I guess. But they starting to think, well, now with all the like the bases, all the military equipments, all the deals, all that have done for us is exposing us to the Iranians and making, and it's funny, like I was watching the news the other day, and Trump made that statement. He said, oh, well, I mean, these bases actually exist in the Gulf countries, and maybe it's time for these Gulf countries to think about protecting the bases. So I was like, oh my God, these bases that were actually there, established and founded to supposedly protect all these small countries from Iran, now is supposed to, like for these Gulf countries to protect the bases from the Iranian attacks, is just a whole another level of like threats and I would say security upended of this long-held understanding between some of the Gulf leaders, that these bases will be a protection for them, and the U.S. is going to be the protector of these smaller states. I don't know if I answered anything. This is not part
No,
of what I was thinking to say, but yeah, feel free to take it.
thank you, Abdullah. No, that was fascinating. Just even the dynamics and the reporting are really, really, really interesting and really valuable insights. I'm going to come back to you in the second round about the questions related to views in the Gulf and dissent and repression. But Hamidreza, I want to circle back to you. And I want to invite in the second round, we're going to move to the second round now. Feel free to respond to anything that was discussed. You can ignore my question if you'd rather respond to something someone else said or any of the questions I asked to other panelists. But Hamidreza, you wrote recently about the Strait of Hormuz, and it came up in this conversation because that seems to be, there are new dynamics there. And I don't know if we've, as a community, really grappled with the wider implications of that. So maybe can I start by sort of asking you, Iran's positionality around the Strait of Hormuz, and what you wrote about was just how it's not being used as a bargaining chip. If I'm characterizing your argument, this is like a permanent rethinking of how it views the Strait of Hormuz. How do you see that? Maybe say more about that, and like how do you see the Hormuz angle? How do you see Iran's view of it? How could that impact Iran relations with Gulf countries? And I might ask others from the Gulf perspective. But let me start with you from that vantage point.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, what I mentioned actually in that piece is that now, at this current moment, and as a result of this war, and as a result of what began somehow as a kind of contingency plan under pressure, Iran has a new approach toward the Strait of Hormuz, which has three different elements. So one is economic. So they look at it as a potential source for revenue, which is something that, especially after this war and due to the destruction, and to give you just an idea what we are talking about, yesterday the government spokesperson for the Iranian government said that it's going to be something around $270 billion, the cost of reconstruction of the country. So we are speaking about a huge amount, and we are speaking about a country under sanctions. So what I said and what I believe is that they are seeing it as a potential source for revenue, like imposing tolls, etc. Of course, there's all sorts of debates about the legality of this in terms of the international law. But on one hand, who cares anymore about the international law? And on the other hand, it's a kind of longer term question. And now we are speaking about the Iranian perception. But then again, one of the things that I mentioned in that article is that even if they want to make some sort of a compromise on that, either in the form of I don't know, joint control over the strait, for example, regional initiative of some sort. I've heard that these ideas have been already on the table in the negotiations, and in the lead up to the negotiations, like the countries involved, Turkey, Pakistan, Egypt, etc., as was mentioned, kind of a joint control. But in whatever form, if they want to concede something, they want to use this as a leverage to get sanctions removal and not just sanctions relief, not something that they got under the JCPOA, under the nuclear deal of 2015. And interestingly, they just woke up to the reality that all this time they have had something that would be work more as a leverage than the nuclear program ever did. Because there's something that experts inside Iran also are arguing, that this idea of Iran being a threshold state, so reaching the nuclear threshold, but not kind of passing that threshold, or going above the threshold, actual weaponization would work as a deterrence. It didn't work, and actually it invited attacks somehow, as it intensified threat perception on the side of the United States, other countries, and kind of contributed to the war against Iran. So that's the idea. But they see the Strait of Hormuz as a leverage on the economic front. And then it's about recognition, and this is very much needed again for a regime that is domestically under, I mean, it is experiencing the lowest level of legitimacy, of course, since its establishment in 1979, especially after the January protests. And also externally, the pressure has been mounting. It wasn't just too long ago that the IRGC was designated by the European countries as well as a terrorist organization. And now what I can tell is that the Iranians are enjoying actually the countries, including European countries, in this case at least France, there was one instance, reaching out to the same IRGC for their ships to be allowed to pass through the strait. So this means recognition. This means regaining legitimacy, if not from inside the country, from the outside. And eventually, it's about the regional order, and that's where it can, we can also discuss the GCC aspect and the Gulf aspect. I do believe that beyond the military logic, I'm not saying that there wasn't a military logic. I've written a lot about the military logic behind the attacks, not to justify it, to explain it. The targeting the early warning systems and radar systems that were used primarily as kind of defense for Israel, not obviously for the Gulf states themselves. But beyond that, some of the strikes, and especially concentrating on some of the GCC members, especially UAE in this case, and also Bahrain, it had to do with the notion of asymmetry that had been formed in the minds of the Iranian leaders. That these guys, and by the way, also, if you wonder why Qatar, why Ras Laffan, that also has to do with the same thing. Just imagine a country under sanctions for 40 years, increasing sanctions. It happens to share a gas field, South Pars, with Qatar, in which this asymmetry has caused the Qataris to be able to get much more than Iran can. And they see, and also when it comes to investment, when it comes to becoming a regional transit hub, everything, the UAE. So they see themselves like their potential eroding as a result of all this pressure. And they see a moment to fill this gap, not by elevating themselves, but to bring others down. And that explains some of the targeting, around the region, like in Qatar, in the UAE. It was about, look, this is the moment. And from this point onward, it's either going to be kind of security and prosperity for all of us or for none of us. That was really the logic that I could see on the Iranian side. So it started as a kind of wartime necessity in the minds and eyes of the Iranian leaders, but then it went into a kind of opportunity, seeing a window of opportunity for kind of changing this asymmetry. And the Strait of Hormuz, of course, works here as in their view as what Mira also mentioned as one of the scenarios of becoming a regional dominant force, a regional hegemon. Because if you control that, it means that you are effectively controlling the trade, UAE's trade. You are effectively controlling other countries' oil exports, and you happen to be on good terms with Oman. So why not coordinating this? So it was actually fascinating that as the war was going on, there were meetings at the level of deputy foreign ministers on legal affairs between Iran and Oman to discuss potential post-war arrangements for the Strait of Hormuz. So the Omanis have refused this. They say that we are a signatory to the, I forgot what exact law was that about the maritime international law. So Iran is not a signatory, by the way. They say they are not going to take tolls for transits, but this is the kind of view that they have. So to wrap it up somehow, what I wanted to say is that, apart from the increased importance of the Strait of Hormuz itself, it has been an arena in which this kind of the different views or the different perspectives that Iran has toward different Gulf actors has been on full display. And it's not by accident that, apart from what I mentioned, it's not by accident that the UAE and Bahrain, as the two signatories to the Abraham Accords, have been hit most by Iran. The UAE tried a lot, and I remember, I mean, speaking to some of the diplomats as well, to kind of walk a tightrope, I would say, but for them it would be a balancing act, working with both Iran and Israel. But more recently, in the past couple of years, the Iranians saw a growing kind of, again, asymmetry in the sense that they were getting reliant more and more on the UAE, and that would give them leverage that would be detrimental for Iranian security. So the war actually brought an opportunity as well, as I said, and I would stop here.
Thanks, Hamidreza. Actually, I'm going to mix the order up because I want to pull on some of those strands with Annelle. But maybe can you, Annelle, provide us a perspective from how the Gulf views some of these developments in the Hormuz Strait? I mean, especially with not just the closing of the strait and Iran's positioning that you just heard Hamidreza talk about, but also like the U.S.'s response of blockading, and then maybe to link it to something you've written before about like one of the real questions here is the long-term, the threat to the long-term economic model in the GCC. And it's not just oil and gas, but obviously the UAE and how it's, I mean, there's so many elements of the economic model that are really put into question. So could I ask you to kind of maybe unpack those threads, and then we'll come to Mira and Abdullah on some of the other things and again, feel free to react to anything you've heard so far.
Sure. Yes, I mean, just reemphasizing what others have said, that it is important to keep in mind that the Gulf states have taken very different approaches. So on the one hand, I think we had the UAE supporting the idea of the blockade, although the UAE was also just saying we should keep hitting Iran. Which is interesting because at the same time that we have the UAE essentially arguing that we need to go all in on this relationship with Israel and with the United States, which generate a lot of pushback from other Gulf countries that are like, what are you talking about? That's crazy. At the same time, I mean, Emiratis are good at hedging. We saw the Emirati vice president reach out to Iranian Speaker of Parliament Ghalibaf to say, let's talk, let's reduce tensions. We also, for the first time, saw the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi make his first visit or official visit to China recently. So clearly, while the Emiratis are saying, this is unacceptable, specifically the Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz and then supporting the U.S. effort to blockade it. And, we need to, everybody should join the Abraham Accords, et cetera, et cetera. That's what they're saying. I think their actions are demonstrating that they're also trying to think realistically about what the future of this relationship looks like. I think the Saudis, on the other hand, had condemned the blockade. The U.S. should lift the blockade, should return to negotiations. They're worried about Iran or the Houthis potentially closing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the bottom of the Red Sea, where the Saudis have been successfully able to bypass the Strait of Hormuz by they just recently reopened the East-West pipeline that had been struck successfully. So they've apparently restored full pumping capacity in order to get some additional oil out that way. And then, as Abdullah mentioned, and others have mentioned that, Oman has, and I think Hamidreza also mentioned, Oman has publicly stated they're not willing to, they're not going to go along with this sort of Iranian plan that Oman and Iran should co-manage the Strait of Hormuz as kind of a toll booth. But obviously, that would be great for Oman if that actually did happen. It's not likely to happen, or at least I think Trump would really struggle to swallow that one. But the Omanis have also really emphasized that we need to return to negotiations. One thing that has been interesting is that although Iran has acknowledged that it has hit the other GCC states, they have said that they did not actually attack Oman, which is questionable. I mean, obviously, there was a loss of sort of control over the chain of command in Iran in the context of war where you had IRGC units that were firing and may have targeted Oman intentionally, even though that wasn't perhaps what the central Iranian government would have wanted. Oman was the GCC state that suffered the fewest attacks. I did want to quibble just a bit with the notion that Bahrain was the second most attacked. At least what I had seen was it was certainly the UAE was the most targeted and suffered the most injuries and deaths, but actually Kuwait dealt with the second most attacks and deaths and injuries. And then Saudi Arabia was the third most, and Bahrain was only the fourth most. This was according to the Gulf Nashra, which was keeping a daily tally of the targeting events and casualties. And I think that probably just reflects geography, that Kuwait was just a little bit easier to hit if you're, an IRGC unit just trying to fire your drones and missiles. And again, that from the Iranian perspective, any of these U.S. Military installations in the Gulf are a fair military target from Iran's perspective, which obviously the GCC states strongly contest that and say in particular any attempts to target civilian infrastructure are war crimes, and that is absolutely the case. I do think it's somewhat ironic that you had Israel making arguments about how Iran was violating international law when you've had Israel violating every aspect of international law for decades, but especially in the past 2.5 years, and the U.S. Providing every manner of support and cover for them and actively dismantling the system, targeting prosecutors at the International Criminal Court in order to prevent accountability for Israel's genocide in Gaza and other violations of international law. The other question that I had been asked to address in the second round was, what does a healthy U.S. Gulf state relationship look like in the future? And specifically, will U.S. willingness to defer to Israel further harm U.S. Gulf relations? And absolutely the answer is yes. The United States approach to the Middle East has long been built around what Washington sees as what's best for Israel or what Israel's preferences are. And so I do think that in a possible future where you no longer have U.S. politicians so controlled by the Israel lobby and so basing their decisions on what Israeli leaders say they want, then you could actually have the U.S. come to a relationship with Gulf states that is more based on their mutual benefit, which again, hopefully would be less about a military relationship, which hopefully the Gulf states are in a position where they are rethinking the wisdom of having this massive U.S. basing presence and instead working more on economic partnerships, which are already there, but again are heavily weighted towards weapon sales and the security partnership. I mean, the future of AI, although I'm somewhat skeptical of that entire paradigm, and it seems like it's here. And we know that, again, this is something that the Gulf states have really invested in heavily, although the war has demonstrated just the vulnerability of the physical infrastructure, not only of data centers, but also just the reality that, there's a reason that for so much of history, this part of the world had a very low human population because, if you don't have water desalination and you don't have the ability to import large amounts of food and electricity and air conditioning, if that crucial infrastructure is gone, this is just not a part of the world that can really sustain life. And so on the one hand, I do think that we're not likely to see the Gulf state, the economic model crumble before our eyes. It is just a big question around these very ambitious goals that, and in particular, you think about Saudi Arabia, which has been trying to transform both its economy and its entire society through extreme levels of repression, to be clear, but also to and then the Gulf as well, just trying to reduce their reliance on oil and to think about a post-oil future. And that really relies on open, obviously the free flow of oil, but also just open economic markets, the possibility to partner with China, and that the United States under Trump, but also under Biden and potentially under future U.S. presidents, is going to ask these countries to choose between the U.S. and China. I think that pressure is likely to become stronger. I think the final question to leave with is just this idea of, to what extent is Iran now seen as the main threat versus Israel seen as the main threat? And I think that in watching the behavior of Gulf states in the near term, we'll be able to have a better sense of where they're coming down on that.
Right. And that's probably the question that has the most splintering probably across the region. Mira, I want to come back to you. I mean, I'm glad that Hamidreza and Annelle moved in the direction of human rights and some of these international laws, some of these questions. But maybe I want to start. I mean, you wrote something very recently that I think probably our audience won't be that familiar with. You wrote that the war has opened an unexpected aperture for introspective commentary amid Gulf commentators and scholars. So what's being discussed, and even as we've discussed, if the underpinnings of the relationship have been called into question, many others have spoken about how, are there really other realistic options for GCC states, and especially with what you said about the various end games being not that great. So maybe can you give us a window into what, what's being said among people, especially from the Gulf about the situation and what's realistic and what options Gulf states have? And again, feel free to answer anything or respond to anything else you've heard.
Thanks, Omar. I'm gonna probably touch on what my colleagues have said, but to respond to your question first, obviously there's a divergence of opinions and opinions that are expressed also where they are allowed to be expressed. So obviously, taking into context the fact that there are deep cracks between Gulf states, some historical even interests that almost never converge. Once we begin to understand that kind of landscape, the idea of a unified security umbrella provided by the U.S. for these countries with so many tensions between them, this idea begins to kind of not hold. How can one security guarantor contain all these tensions between them? I mean, like Abdullah had pointed out, the rift between Saudi Arabia and the UAE came into open over Yemen. And the response of the U.S. was really ambiguous, and it disappointed both allies. And we've seen the hedging begin at that point. We've seen Saudi Arabia kind of formalize a defense pact with Pakistan, which now it has also activated as a result of this war. We've seen the UAE make similar overtures with India, I think mostly to spite Saudi Arabia and also to gesture to the U.S. more than a real effort to diversify. But it's important to note that diversifying your arms supplier is not equivalent to diversifying your security alliances. And this is where Gulf commentators have actually kind of made interesting, kind of contributed to the conversations. Now, Gulf states have sourced different gadgets from Ukraine, South Korea, some France, Italy, I guess. But I think they're seeking a security umbrella akin to what the U.S. is providing, not just hardware. I think the U.S. Really served as a scarecrow more than anything. But the crows realized quickly that it's just a straw man. And where is the delivery of everything that we thought you would deliver? And I think Gulf states thought that the U.S. would just kind of deliver what it delivered to Israel, that they would really kind of annihilate really Iran within 1 week. Really, that is what they expected, at least for the more hawkish Gulf states. I don't think the other Gulf states necessarily want to see humanitarian disasters happening again. I think I want to say bring up an issue here that I think didn't kind of feature yet. The UAE has a deeper grievance with Iran that other Gulf states don't have, pertaining to the occupied islands, which Iran consistently refers to as Iranian islands. To the UAE, these are occupied Emirati islands that were illegally given to the Shah's Iran by the British. Now, the Iranians understand the illegality of what the British did to Palestine, giving it to, the Zionist organizations and settlers. So how come they don't see the illegality of this? The displacement of, people from these islands who eventually moved to the UAE. So this issue is a sticking point. So the UAE, because of this, does not want to see an expansive dominance of Iran over Hormuz as well, on top of the occupied islands. I think other GCC states are less sensitive about this. I mean, even the GCC has not done, as an organization, has not done anything for the UAE in relation to this issue, for instance. So I think for the UAE, this is very important. The other important thing is they do not want to rely on the Yanbu east-west pipeline of Saudi Arabia, which was struck recently. The Saudis did not name the perpetrator. Iran said it wasn't us, it was the UAE. I don't think it was the UAE because we would have known. The Saudis would not have let the UAE get away with it. I think it was the Israelis who did that. There's no evidence, I'm speculating here, but I don't think it was the UAE. I don't think the UAE wants to rely on Saudi. I don't think they want to contribute to financing a separate route and putting money into Saudi economy. They do not want to be reliant on a second hegemon, which is Saudi Arabia. The UAE wants to emerge as the hegemon of the region. It sees itself as such. It is little Sparta after all, isn't it? You asked me a question. It was a question that's listed, but you didn't bring it up. But I want to answer that in relation to the Gulf populations. I think many pan-Gulfists understand that there are tensions between Gulf states that will prevent them coming together, working in a consortium to resolve these issues together. But when Gulf states invoke the expansionist and hegemonic ambitions of Iran and Israel as twin threats defining their security perceptions and the regional order, I think they omit their own hegemonic projects being pursued by certain Gulf states, namely the UAE, of course, and Saudi Arabia. I think being open about this is necessary, which is something that Gulf academics are unable to do, I think. As it would signal to Gulf states, or Gulf populations at least, that we're not sitting ducks sandwiched defenselessly between two predators, and we may fall prey to, either one. The idea that we could coalesce as populations around, a project of our own is a narrative worth building on, but I think I can see why this would not sit well with many ruling elites in the Gulf, because they themselves are competing with each other for dominance, and any frank acknowledgement would only kind of intensify the infighting between them. But we've heard, as Annelle said, Bloomberg also reported this morning that Turkey is hosting this talk for about a Middle East security framework that will involve Saudi, Pakistan, potentially Egypt. The fact that Saudi is invited and not any other Gulf state is sort of like an acknowledgement of who the potential dominant actor in the Gulf is. I don't think that will sit well with other Gulf states, especially the UAE. But then I don't see why Iran cannot eventually join that club. In fact, I don't see why Iran might not even have a military base in Oman one day. I think that things can change that dramatically. And I think Gulf states have that sort of anxiety about how things can change overnight, and they're trying to kind of preempt all these changes. The UAE and Bahrain, maybe potentially Kuwait, are really still placing all their eggs in this perforated Israeli basket of the Abraham Accords. I don't think this will fare well for them in the short or long term. but I think this is how they perceive the changes happening around them.
Fascinating, Mira. Abdullah, I want to come back to you and sort of ask you to characterize reactions. And you've heard Mira started us down this road, reactions of the populations in the Gulf to this war, as well as the way in which, and again, and I'll reference this, the way in which Gulf states are utilizing oppressive measures, often with, backing or tools from the United States to prevent unrest and maybe I can add to that question, if you could speculate how some of these changes that we've discussed or evolution in the U.S. Gulf, how could that affect human rights in the Gulf?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me second what Mira said on the attack on the east-west Yanbu route. I remember when analysts from the ground who was reporting on the war at that time was shocked. He said, "How come they say a drone or whatever coming from UAE from Iran? That's the narrative at that time in the beginning of the attack." Came all the way from the western side, from the eastern side of Saudi Arabia to the other way of the western side, almost to the Red Sea, and then attack. And none of these, detectors or whatever, identify it. Nobody knew until it attacked. It must have been a really advanced thing that only some player like Israel has. Now, yes, nobody said it's Israel and it's not confirmed. We cannot tell, but I've seen semi-official, not official, like blogs, posts really close to the royal court in Saudi Arabia, actually insinuating it was the UAE. And I think their idea is either because they cannot handle like pointing finger to Israel, and it's like an easier target. And also, maybe also they're thinking that the UAE has this idea that put in Israel's head to do that because it's also an interest somehow to the UAE as well. And it's easier during the war to just say it's Iran, it's part of the attacks, you know. So anyway, I think that's important also to see how the fingerprints of Israel throughout the war, not just on Iran, but also on Gulf countries. We remember also Qatar at one point. I think only Tucker Carlson and then some other news outlets reported later that agents that were thought to be Mossad or Israeli agents were detained trying to harm or plant something in some Gulf countries. So I think we should really take that into account on how we should not think of Israel as like, oh, it's just a player against Iran. It's a force that is, I think, threatening the whole region. So that's a point I want to make. So coming back to the question, yes. So I think what the Gulf countries, given that they are autocratic by nature, they use such an opportunity to crack down more on their population instead of unifying the front by allowing more space and giving them more chance and having elections or things like that. I think it's like I'm talking about Bigfoot or unicorn or something really, really weird in the Gulf now, especially even after the parliament was dissolved in Kuwait. There was the only semi-democratic state in the Gulf. Now, Saudi Arabia let's remember, like in the first, like in the 12th war in 2025, in the second day of the war, they actually executed Turki al-Jasser, a prominent Saudi journalist, and took advantage and assuming that everybody is busy with the war. So why not taking advantage of that and just, slide in there some of the atrocities that otherwise is going to face a lot of backlash and outcry by people around the world. But nevertheless, it was reported on. Now, Kuwait is doing that in a lesser extent by arresting and detaining Ahmed Shahabuddin. And by the way, it's not he's not alone. Some of your colleagues mentioned that tens of Kuwaitis have been detained throughout the war for the past 6 to 7 weeks. In the UAE also, reported 300 and something people were detained over also spreading false information and doing that. I think Saudi Arabia has been leading on that front from day one. And by the way, almost all Gulf states, I don't know about Oman, but at least the other Gulf states for sure, have been really adamant in trying to say to their population, don't record, don't take pictures, don't spread any information about the war, either right or wrong. And then in Saudi Arabia, they have it was trended for many days that if you do that, it's a crime that is going to be tried by the cyber security crime law that they have. Also, Kuwait started doing that. Other countries also have done that in the Gulf. So it's for them not. And by the way, the narrative that Saudi and other Gulf states are saying is that, oh, because when you take pictures and record videos, you're helping, quote unquote, the enemy, like if Iran needs a recording to know where the Prince Sultan base is, for example, or Prince Fahad or King Fahad base is. It's like, oh, they need a picture from a population. It's they know it's just a made up excuse for them to crack on the population. So they do not want people to know more about the war. That's why they have been less transparent, to the degree that we learn about damages to bases or embassies of the U.S. or whatever in Saudi Arabia and other countries from the U.S. like after a few days. Like Saudi Arabia has not even reported that. We only learned, for example, about the service member who was killed from the CENTCOM, not from Saudi Arabia, like days after the incident. When Saudi Arabia actually the first days of that incident just basically denied anything happening. And when I posted something on X, I remember like people close to the government just were showering me with tweets like, oh, don't spread this information, it's false, it's only from the enemy, it's never true, whatever. And then later they admitted anyway. So it's part of so they started arresting people. Saudi Arabia also last weekend executed child defendants after a while of not doing that. They actually have executed 5 people on one day, I think 3 or 4 days ago. We have seen these developments of human rights, deterioration of human rights in the Gulf, and not because of the war, but I think in spite of it, meaning they took advantage of the war, not because they wanted to respond properly and make sure that they wanted to control the narrative on one hand, and be more oppressive and take advantage of the war towards that front, not on the front of unifying people and being more free.
Thanks, Abdullah. This has been such a rich conversation. Unfortunately, we only have 10 minutes left. So I do want to do a quick third round. What I'm going to do is I see one hand in the audience, my colleague, Raed. I'm going to ask him to make a quick, very quick comment or question. I'll then read a couple of questions that are in the chat and I've also received directly. And then we'll give each panelist 1 minute exactly to wrap up, and we'll wrap up in 10 minutes. So Raed, why don't you come in with a very quick comment or question? Alex, can you let Raed in, or is
yeah, I just unmuted him.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey everyone, thank you, Omar, and thanks for all the speakers. This is an excellent time to have this conversation. Appreciate all of the remarks of our guests. My name is Raed Jarrar. I am Dawn's advocacy director. I'm based in Washington, D.C. And I want to make 2 quick comments, mostly, following up on what Abdullah said. The first one is the split inside the GCC, and there were signs of a split earlier, especially between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But now we definitely have a strategic, in some cases, irreconcilable differences between two camps in the GCC. There is the camp led by UAE and Kuwait and Bahrain to a degree. And there is definitely another camp where Oman and Qatar and Saudi Arabia seem to be congregated there. So there is definitely like a major shift within the GCC that we're going to see its effects in the upcoming weeks and months, including the main theories of coordination, whether it is political or military. The second point I want to say is, based on what Annelle was saying regarding rethinking the security apparatus in the GCC. Back in the 1980s, GCC countries saw Iran as the enemy, and they saw U.S. bases as an assurance to protect them from Iran. In 2026, many of these countries do not see Iran as an enemy anymore. I mean, even UAE had multi-billion-dollar trade relationship with Iran. They had okay relationships with Iran. Some of them had excellent relationships with Iran, like Qatar and Oman, and even Saudi Arabia was having good relationships with Iran. So the point is now in 2026, the U.S. bases have turned into a liability. They are a magnet of instability. They are the sole reason why their countries got bombed and attacked. And I am 100% sure that we're going to see some very serious realignment in the region based on these new calculations. You know, as Abdullah was saying, Trump now says, you have to protect our bases from Iran. It's really very funny. So they're definitely making serious recalculations in the region to think, is it worth it to have the United States, Trump's United States, be on our land, bringing in instability and attracting, threats from the neighbors, and not providing us with any protection. We saw how the U.S. dedicated all of its defenses to protect Israel. So I think it is a really important strategic moment, and I definitely agree that the upcoming short period will witness major shifts in the GCC.
Thanks, Rod. A lot of food for thought there. Let me add one or two more questions that have come to me, and then I'm going to give each speaker 1 minute to choose something they want to respond to, and we'll wrap up. So one question that I received was about what influence does the Gulf have on the current negotiations, the Pakistan-mediated talks? Is it boxed out? Does it have, could the Gulf seek a deal maybe with Iran? That this was, I think, alluded to by a couple of you, that with Iran that cuts out Washington. What could that look like? And then there's a couple of questions in the chat, and I won't read them all, but there's a question about, why Israel or the UAE, which was mentioned, might have attacked Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline. What was the objective there? There was a question about Gulf. The question was about Gulf-India relations, but I could broaden it out to more generally the migrant labor that's in the Gulf and how these shifts could change some bilateral relationships and also migrant labor flows. And finally, there's questions in here about threshold and conditions for, and many have talked about this, a shifting strategic alliance, but also, would that actually happen in the region? You can see some of the detailed questions in the chat. So I'm going to go in reverse order, and I'm going to give everybody, really just stick to a minute so we're on time, a chance to say a final word and respond to any of the above they would like. So Abdullah, why don't you start, and we'll go in reverse order.
Well, it's not fair, all these questions, but I'll try. Quickly to the East-West, I think for me, why you think Israel and think it's in its interest to do that? Well, a few things. One important objective for Israel is involving Saudi Arabia into the war against Iran. That has been a main objective for Iran, for Israel since day one. They wanted that to happen. That's why the leaks. That's why some of the things that you see, the reporting, and making Saudi Arabia I mean, basically pushing Saudi Arabia in the corner where they think it's all from Iran and they have to respond back and be more offensive. I think and it's part, or also why it's part of the rift, because Saudi Arabia could see through that and could see not through that the whole thing, but could see the fingers that it's not Iran as they used to see. It's not the nature of the attack that they usually get from Iran, or the level of accuracy and all that. And also how the remaining from all the attack, it just basically point finger to something that other than Iran has. I just want to point to that.
Thank you, Abdullah, for that. Let me go to Annelle.
Thanks. Just very quickly, I echo Abdullah's point that Israel would love to have the Gulf and Iran fight this out between themselves. Israel would see that as being very much in their interest. I mean, I loved Raed's point, and I agree that ostensibly you'd think the GCC countries it would be obvious that they need to rethink the wisdom of having these U.S. bases. I mean, I hope that happens. I mean, my overarching point is I hope that the entire world rethinks their reliance on the United States. You think about from tariffs Trump has imposed to just the effects of this war, the UN projecting that hundreds of millions of people will be pushed into poverty as a result of this. I mean, this has huge global implications. And I very much hope that the whole world is recalibrating its reliance on the United States as both a security and an economic partner. And I think we're also seeing that with efforts to do things like, reduce reliance on the US dollar, for example. I think this would be in the interests not only of the world, but in the long term of the United States itself. Although, again, I'm a little bit skeptical of the swiftness with which we're likely to see the Gulf states and other countries taking these measures, just given the extent of the economic and security relationships. And in the Gulf, the fact that they are dealing with such an economic pinch. And so anything that sort of requires additional expenses, they're likely to just kind of continue down the same line that they're on, but hopefully with sort of a long-term plan to shift.
Thank you. Mira.
Thanks. I'm going to be really brief. I'm timing myself. So I don't think really that I agree that U.S. bases in the Gulf are turned out to be a liability. I don't think we would not have been targeted if the bases were not there. I think there's a different strategy that Iran has, and Hamidreza can correct me if I'm wrong. I think sharing the burden of this war of the U.S. belligerence and European complicity as well with the sanctions and everything else. This was really the end goal of targeting the Gulf, not just because the American bases were there, because they were supposedly emptied. And targeting them or not really didn't do much if you come to think about it. So I think really it is about sharing the burden and the costs of this war. And also, if we think of Iran as an emerging hegemon, it wants to hold that whip and remind its neighbors who's boss. So that's really about the idea here that I'm going to remind you who's boss here. So even if you bring in any sort of bases, any sort of military bases, you're going to be struck. Thank you.
Thank you. Hamidreza, last word. This is the right time.
Just 2 quick points on the 2 things that was mentioned by other colleagues here. One on Kuwait, Annelle was quite right, but the reason wasn't just geography. It was because, and the reason it continued actually over time, it was the same reason that Al Harir base in Iraqi Kurdistan was targeted, because those were the ones that could be used for ground operation and also heliborne operations. So both Al Udairi in Kuwait and also Al Harir in Iraq, that was the reason. So there was a military reason for that. And on UAE, I mean, good that you mentioned the islands. That's of course, I mean, even if regardless of all the things that I mentioned, that is shared somehow with other countries of the region, that's unique to the UAE and this dispute. But I don't think that comparing it to the issue of Palestine is really the right framing, honestly. I mean, I do call them disputed, but first of all, there wasn't the UAE when the deal was reached. So it was, of course, Arab Emirates, but no United Arab Emirates. And then the Sheikh of Sharjah was at least involved on the deal about Abu Musa. I know that the other two ones were taken by force from Ras Al Khaimah. And then the third one is that Bahrain was part of an exchange. So, bringing into question the deal would mean bringing into question the Bahraini independence somehow as well. So I would be a bit more cautious on framing of this, but I do call them disputed always.
Thank you so much. There is no dispute that this was an incredible panel. So thank you all for your contributions. Thank you all for joining us. Sorry, went 2 minutes over. Please make sure to sign up for Don's email list so you can receive events information like that. And again, really thank you, Abdullah, Mira, Annelle, Hamidreza, for sharing your insights. I know I learned a lot. Thank you all very much.